Picture this. You finish dinner and glance at the clock. You have 20 minutes before the next obligation. Or maybe you decide to take a longer walk and give yourself 40. Both choices look almost identical from the outside. You put on your shoes, you step outside, you start moving. No sweating, no gasping for air, no obvious sign that anything important is happening. And that's why most people assume the difference between a 20-minute walk and a 40-minute walk is just more of the same. Now let me ask you an uncomfortable question. If we could pause time and look inside your abdomen at the 20-minute mark, and then again at the 40-minute mark, would your visceral fat look calm and cooperative? Or would it still be quietly on guard, holding on to energy just in case? Most people never consider that possibility. They assume fat loss is linear, that if 20 minutes is good, 40 minutes is just double the calories. But visceral fat doesn't work like a fuel gauge. It works like a security system. Most people assume walking is too gentle to matter, that if you're not pushing hard, your body isn't making meaningful decisions. From that point of view, 20 minutes or 40 minutes shouldn't change much. Movement is movement. Calories are calories. But clinicians and metabolic researchers see something very different. They see that duration doesn't just increase effort. It changes the message your body receives about safety, stress, and energy demand. Here's the part that often gets missed. Visceral fat is not passive. It surrounds your organs for a reason. It responds strongly to stress hormones, blood sugar signals, and nervous system tone. And it is far more cautious about releasing energy than the fat under your skin. That means it doesn't respond to movement immediately. It waits, it watches, it looks for patterns. Stay with me, because what happens next is rarely talked about. This is not a debate about whether walking is good or bad. This is about understanding why a 20-minute walk and a 40-minute walk can produce very different internal outcomes, even when they feel almost the same to you. The difference isn't willpower, it isn't discipline, and it isn't fitness level. The difference is time under the right biological conditions. 20 minutes can start a conversation inside your body. 40 minutes can change the tone of that conversation completely. By the end of this, you'll understand why some people walk every day and see no change in their belly fat, while others extend their walks just a little longer and suddenly notice a shift. Not because they worked harder, but because their body finally received enough information to change its mind. To see why that happens, we need to look past steps and calories and meet the system that actually decides whether visceral fat stays locked or becomes available. And once you see who's really in charge, the difference between 20 and 40 minutes will make perfect sense. To understand that difference, we have to shift our attention away from your legs and even away from the fat itself. The real decision maker here isn't how far you walk or how many calories you burn. It's the internal environment your body creates around visceral fat while you're moving. And that environment is controlled by your blood flow, your hormones, and your nervous system working together in real time. Yes, visceral fat is the organ we're talking about. But even more important than the fat itself is the system that surrounds and regulates it. Think of your heart as the pump, your blood vessels as the highway system, and your hormones as the traffic signals. The fat cells don't decide much on their own. They respond to what's flowing past them and what messages are being delivered. If the highways are narrow, stiff, and congested, the pump has to work harder. Blood pressure rises, stress signals stay elevated, and fat cells interpret that environment as unstable. In that context, releasing energy feels risky. Holding on feels safer. This is why visceral fat behaves so differently from the fat under your skin. It's positioned right next to your organs, and it's wired to respond to threat quickly. Here are a few numbers that help frame this without fear, just awareness. Visceral fat is strongly associated with insulin resistance, cardiovascular disease risk, and metabolic dysfunction, even in people who don't appear overweight. Many adults carry significant visceral fat without realizing it because it doesn't always change how clothes fit. At the same time, large studies using wearable data have shown that meaningful health benefits begin at surprisingly low levels of movement, but those benefits don't rise in a straight line. They depend on how long the body stays in a low-stress, well-regulated state. This is where time starts to matter more than effort. Visceral fat doesn't respond to a spike of activity the way muscle does. It responds to sustained signals that tell the body, choose over and over, that energy is being used in a controlled, predictable way. That stress is not escalating. That blood sugar is being handled. That circulation is flowing smoothly. A 20-minute walk begins to change this environment. Blood flow improves. Vascular resistance starts to drop. Stress signals soften slightly. But for many people, especially those who are highly stressed, insulin resistant, or sedentary, that window may not be long enough for the body to fully relax its grip on visceral fat. The system is still evaluating, still cautious. A 40-minute walk extends that signal. It gives your nervous system more time to settle. It allows hormones like cortisol to decline instead of rebound. It keeps blood flow elevated long enough for fat cells to sense that this demand isn't a threat. The warehouses don't just crack the door open, they start preparing to ship. This is why comparing 20 minutes to 40 minutes isn't about doubling your effort. It's about crossing a biological threshold. One duration introduces the idea that energy is being used. The other confirms that it's safe to continue. Once you see visceral fat as a responder to environment rather than a passive storage site, the comparison becomes much clearer. The question isn't how much harder you walked. The question is how long your body stayed in a state that made letting go feel safe. And that brings us to the timeline itself, because the first 20 minutes follow a very specific internal sequence. Understanding that sequence explains exactly why time changes everything. The moment you start walking, the internal clock begins, even though nothing about it feels intense. In the first minute or two, your muscles ask for a little more oxygen, not urgently, just enough to signal that you're no longer resting. Your nervous system registers this and shifts slightly out of full idle mode. Your heart responds by beating a bit faster and a bit stronger, not because you're under stress, but because it's adjusting to a new, manageable demand. As blood flow increases, something important happens inside your blood vessels. The inner lining, the endothelium, senses the movement of blood brushing past it. This lining isn't passive. It's a living, responsive surface. That flow triggers the release of relaxing signals, including nitric oxide, which encourage the vessels to open and soften. Resistance drops. Circulation becomes smoother. Your heart doesn't have to push as hard to move blood through the system. At this stage, visceral fat is not being burned. That's a crucial point. The first couple of minutes are about preparation, not release. Your body is reducing friction. It's improving flow. It's gathering information. Is this a brief interruption, or is this the beginning of a sustained pattern? As you move into the 3 to 10-minute range, the shift becomes more noticeable internally, even if you don't feel it consciously. Your breathing rhythm changes. Inhales become a little deeper, exhales become more complete. This breathing pattern feeds back into your nervous system, nudging it away from a constant alert state and toward a more balanced tone. Stress signals begin to soften, not disappear, but loosen their grip. Blood vessels continue to respond to sustained flow. They become more flexible in real time, reducing the pressure your heart has to work against. Muscles start taking up glucose more efficiently, which reduces the need for high insulin signaling. Again, nothing dramatic happens. There's no sudden switch. But the conditions that keep visceral fat locked begin to weaken. As you approach the 20-minute mark, many people assume the work is done. From a calorie perspective, that might be true. But from a visceral fat perspective, this is still a transitional phase. For people who are highly stressed, insulin-resistant, or accustomed to long periods of sitting, cortisol signaling may still be elevated. Insulin patterns may not have fully stabilized. Visceral fat senses this and remains cautious. At 20 minutes, your body has improved circulation, softened stress signaling, and reduced some resistance, but it has not yet fully committed to releasing deep stored energy. Think of it as the system saying, "I'm listening, but I'm not convinced yet." The message is promising, but it hasn't been sustained long enough to feel completely safe. This is why 20 minutes can feel good, clear your head, and support overall health, yet still produce limited change in visceral fat for many people. The groundwork is being laid, the environment is improving, but the internal negotiation isn't finished. To understand what changes when you keep walking past that point, and why 40 minutes crosses a different biological threshold, we need to follow the timeline further, into the phase where repetition and duration start to reshape how your body handles energy entirely. When you continue walking beyond the 20-minute mark, something important begins to shift. This is where the body stops evaluating and starts adapting. Blood flow remains elevated long enough for hormonal signals to change more decisively. Cortisol, which tends to stay high when the body perceives uncertainty, begins to fall instead of hovering. Insulin signaling becomes steadier rather than reactive. The message your system receives is no longer temporary effort. It becomes controlled demand. As you move through the 30-minute range and toward 40 minutes, your body has now spent enough uninterrupted time in a low-stress, well-regulated state to change its priorities. Visceral fat cells sense that energy is being used consistently without threat. The environment around them feels stable. Blood vessels are open. Circulation is smooth. The nervous system is no longer scanning for danger. This is when visceral fat becomes willing to participate. At this stage, fat cells begin releasing fatty acids more freely into circulation to support ongoing movement. This isn't a dramatic surge you feel. It's a quiet shift in fuel sourcing. The body transitions from relying primarily on circulating glucose toward drawing more from stored energy. Not because you forced it, but because you stayed long enough for the signal to settle. This is the core difference between walking for 20 minutes and walking for 40. 20 minutes initiates the process. 40 minutes completes the message. Cheek one tells the body that movement is happening. The other tells the body that movement is safe to sustain. Visceral fat responds to that distinction. Pace matters here, but only to a point. You don't need to walk fast. You don't need to strain. A steady, slightly brisk pace that keeps you moving without pushing you into discomfort tends to reinforce the right signals. Too slow, and the stimulus may be too weak. Too intense, and stress hormones can rise again, counteracting the effect. The goal is a rhythm your body can trust. Over time, repeating this pattern trains the system. Your cardiovascular network becomes more efficient. Blood vessels learn to stay flexible. Hormonal responses become less exaggerated. And visceral fat, no longer constantly on guard, gradually loses its reason to stay tightly stored. This is why some people notice that extending their walks, even without changing pace, leads to changes they never saw with shorter sessions. They didn't work harder. They stayed longer. And in doing so, they crossed the threshold where the body stops preparing and starts releasing. But duration alone doesn't tell the whole story. There are specific moments when a 40-minute walk becomes even more powerful, moments most people overlook entirely. And understanding those windows can make the difference between slow progress and meaningful change over time. One of those moments happens at a time most people don't think of as fat-burning time at all. It's what happens when you walk after you eat, or after a stressful part of your day, when your body is already metabolically busy handling something else. After a meal, your blood sugar rises and insulin increases to move that sugar into cells. From your body's perspective, this is a storage-focused window. Energy has arrived. The system is cautious. Visceral fat, in particular, interprets this as a reason to stay protected. Sitting down after eating reinforces that message. Blood flow stays relatively low in working muscles, insulin remains elevated longer, and the signal to store is repeated again and again. A 20-minute walk after a meal can help. It redirects some blood flow toward muscles and encourages glucose uptake without requiring as much insulin. Blood sugar peaks become lower and smoother. The message to visceral fat becomes less aggressive. But for many people, especially those with insulin resistance or high stress, that shorter window may only interrupt the process rather than fully change it. A 40-minute walk after a meal extends that interruption into a transition. Insulin levels have more time to settle. Muscles continue using incoming fuel. Blood vessels stay open longer. The environment shifts from storage to balance. Over time, this reduces how often visceral fat is reinforced as a default energy reserve. Not in a single day, but cumulatively. The same principle applies after stress. When you experience stress, cortisol rises and tells your body to keep energy close, especially around vital organs. Sitting still while stressed often allows that signal to linger. A short walk can take the edge off. A longer, steady walk gives your nervous system enough time to fully step out of alert mode. Cortisol begins to fall more meaningfully. The body receives a clearer signal that the threat has passed. This is why people sometimes notice that longer walks feel different than shorter ones, especially in the evening or after emotionally demanding days. It's not just psychological relief, it's a physiological shift. The system has time to reset instead of just pause. Over weeks and months, these windows add up. Clinicians don't just look at weight. They see changes in waist measurements, improvements in fasting insulin, more stable blood pressure, and faster recovery after exertion. People feel less winded, less reactive, more resilient. These are signs that the metabolic environment is changing, not just energy balance. Research has helped clarify why this happens. Large studies have shown that benefits begin at surprisingly low step counts, but they also suggest that continuous time spent moving matters more than isolated bursts. The body seems to respond more favorably to longer periods of calm, sustained activity than to short interruptions, especially when visceral fat is involved. This doesn't mean everyone must walk 40 minutes every day. It means understanding why longer sessions produce different results helps you choose intentionally. A 20-minute walk is valuable. A 40-minute walk sends a stronger, more convincing signal. Neither is wrong. They simply speak different biological languages. And before closing this loop, it's important to be clear about safety. Walking is one of the safest forms of movement available, but anyone experiencing chest pain, dizziness, unusual shortness of breath, or who has known heart disease, uncontrolled blood pressure, or is recovering from surgery should get medical guidance before making changes. The goal isn't pushing through warning signs. It's building a pattern your body can adapt to safely. At the start of this story, we asked a simple question about 20 minutes versus 40. Now you can see it's not about effort or discipline. It's about duration and context. Your body adapts to what you repeatedly ask it to do. When you ask for calm, sustained movement long enough, visceral fat eventually listens. What surprised you most here? Was it how long it takes before visceral fat responds, the importance of post-meal and post-stress walking, or the idea that longer doesn't mean harder, just steadier? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you're comfortable, share how long you usually walk. Someone reading your experience might need that reassurance. In the next video, we'll explore why stress can quietly block fat loss even when you're walking consistently, and how to recognize when that's happening inside your body.